Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Ki Tavo, when you enter into the land, the seventh Torah portion in Sefer Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, beginning in chapter 26. As the portion begins, Moshe relates a beautiful vision of the future to this generation which is about to enter into the land without him. He instructs them in the commandment of Bikurim, the bringing of the first fruits of the land up to the holy temple to be fulfilled each year. With great joy, the individual will present the fruits with which the land has been blessed, while standing before the altar of Hashem, acknowledging and expressing his thanks to God for all the good in his own life, in his own personal life, as well as in the life of the nation. And while yet addressing the nation back there in the land of Moab, Moshe goes on to describe a unique ceremony which the children of Israel are commanded to enact upon their entry into the land of Israel on the very first day. We read, "And Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, Observe the entire commandment that I command you this day, and it will be, on the day that you cross the Jordan to the land that Hashem your God is giving you, that you shall set up for yourself huge stones and plaster them with lime. When you cross, you shall write upon them all the words of this Torah, in order that you may come to the land which Hashem your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as Hashem, God of your forefathers, has spoken to you. And it will be, when you cross the Jordan, that you shall set up these stones, of which I command you this day, on Mount Abel, and you shall plaster them with lime. And there you shall build an altar to Hashem your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield any iron upon them. You shall build the altar of Hashem your God out of whole stones, and on it you shall offer up burnt offerings to Hashem your God, and you shall slaughter peace offerings, and you shall eat there, and you shall rejoice before Hashem your God. You shall write upon the stones all the words of this Torah well clarified." So Moshe hereby informs the people that the very first task that will be entrusted to them upon crossing the Jordan, and immediately upon entering the land, the very first thing on their very first day will be to set up these huge monumental stones, to plaster them, and to write upon them all the words of the Torah. They're instructed to build an altar upon Mount Abel and to bring offerings upon it, and afterwards to hold the assembly of Mount Gerizim and Mount Abel, where the nation will formalize and seal a renewed covenant with Hashem regarding all these commandments. Our sages explain that at Mount Abel, these stones were used to make the altar upon which the offerings of the covenant were brought. These offerings were olot, burnt offerings that are completely consumed, and shlamim, meaning whole or complete, from the word shalem and related to shalom, and thus known as peace offerings. The burnt offering, completely given over to Hashem, completely consumed, symbolizes our willingness to devote our entire existence to serving Hashem. The shlamim, as Rabbi Hirsch teaches, are brought as a demonstration of joyful recognition of our dependence on God for every aspect of our lives. The ceremony also included this national acceptance of the blessings and the curses. But the most important, the most prominent aspect of the covenant are these great stones. These stones were to be an expression, somehow a testimony of Israel's covenant over the inheritance of the land. Now, there are varying opinions among the sages as to exactly what was inscribed on these stones, whether it was the entire Torah, or only the section of the blessings and the curses, or perhaps a listing of the 613 commandments. But whatever the case, not only were words of the Torah written on these stones, but our sages teach that the verse's expression, the words of this Torah well clarified, means that these words were also written in 70 languages, all of the then spoken languages of the entire world. The actual event takes place several weeks later in the book of Joshua, in chapter 4. There we learn that Joshua commanded for 12 stones to be taken from the places where the feet of the Kohanim stood in the Jordan River, and that these stones should be brought to the nation's first stop in the land. And it came to pass, when all the nation were clean passed over the Jordan, that Hashem spoke to Joshua, saying, Take for yourself 12 men out of the people, out of every tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take out of the midst of the Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood, 12 stones made ready, and carry them over with you. So on the very day of crossing the Jordan, the stones from the river were taken and then brought to Mount Abel as Moshe commanded, and there they were used to make the altar upon which the offerings of the covenant were brought. Following the covenantal ceremony, the altar was dismantled, and the 12 stones were carried to Gilgal. What was the purpose of this elaborate procedure initiated by Moshe in the land of Moab and finally consummated by Joshua in the land of Israel? What do these stones represent, and why did Moshe ascribe them such importance that Israel should cross the Jordan and immediately travel all the way to Mount Avel, quite a distance from the Jordan River, through territories that were occupied by sworn enemies, to build an altar there, to write there all the words of this Torah on its stones, and then to continue to travel that very day to Gilgal? So open up your heart in the deepest way to this amazing message. Stones which bore witness to the crossing of the Jewish people into the land were taken from the bottom of the river, and then the very first thing that the nation was commanded to do before settling in, before unpacking, was to establish Torah as the guidepost, as the very purpose of being in the land, well clarified, meaning in every language known to man. Write the words of the Torah on the stones, so that all will know that for the sake of keeping the Torah, you have entered into this land, and this is your entire claim and right to this land. Torah is our deed to the land. The act of erecting these stones and the inscription they bore broadcast a message to all the world and to those who constantly question Israel's right to this land. It is the nation's observance of Torah which entitles her to this land. We receive it only in the merit of the Torah and the observance of its commandments. As our verse tells us clearly, you shall write upon them all the words of this Torah, so that you may come to the land which Hashem your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as Hashem, God of your forefathers, has spoken to you. Written in every language, the message is broadcast to the entire world that we are servants of Hashem in this land. But open up your heart in the very deepest way. The words of the Torah were also written in all the spoken languages of the nations, so that its wisdom will be available to all the nations of the world, so that the Torah's vision of a rectified world would reach their hearts as well, and so that the nation of Israel would be reminded on their very first day as a nation in their land that their inheritance of this land is not simply as a birthright, but they have been entrusted with a great challenge, with a mission and purpose. Israel is commanded to establish themselves as a model nation, to serve as a beacon to the peoples of the entire world, to beckon to all people, to demonstrate for all, by example, what it means to lead a life of commitment to Hashem's will. The 12 stones of the 12 tribes of Israel, assembled together into one pillar, represent the entire nation, dedicated to the service of God like one man with one heart, united and unified in the land of Israel by observing Torah and shining its light unto the nations. And thus, immediately upon entering this land, they were commanded to engrave this message on massive stones so that it would be impressed on their hearts as well, and in the environs of the city of Shechem, of all places. Why? Because it was there that hundreds of years earlier, the patriarch Abraham received the blessing in Genesis 12, and you shall be a blessing, and through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so from the nation's very first moment in the land, Hashem commanded Israel to inscribe Torah into all the languages of the world, to remind us that Israel is to be concerned with the fate of the nations, because Israel must take responsibility for teaching the nations. And following now in the footsteps of Abraham, the nation sanctifies its first act in the land by demonstrating its recognition of its universal mission, its readiness to bring the message of Torah to the entire world. Shalom, dear friends. Thank you so much for your support. We appreciate it so very much. It's only your support that enables Jerusalem Lights to continue its outreach of Torah for everyone.